this morning, I would like for you to think about the very best meal you have ever had. I'll give you a minute to think about it. What made it so special? Was it the food itself, or was it the people you shared your table with? The conversation, the camaraderie, the feeling of belonging and acceptance and inclusion. Well, this morning, I would like to talk about tables and the way they can impact our faith stories. There's a lot that happens around a table. They can be used to bring us into relationship with one another. It's a place to make announcements. It's a place to do business. When you go on job interviews, you're often asked, what do you bring to the table? Which means, how can you enhance the fellowship we already have? One of the habits of healthy families raising resilient children is that they eat at least one meal together around a table. Not in front of the TV, but around a table. Now, tables can also be used to separate us from one another, like the tables we see in a courtroom, where you have the defendant on one side and the accusers on the other, very much separated at different tables. So the question we want to consider today is, how are we using our tables to share our faith story, our testimony of Jesus moving in our lives? We're in the midst of an exploration about sharing our faith stories with others, specifically those who are still seeking to find relationship with Jesus and the church. And we are taking some of this teaching from the book Surprise the World by Michael Frost. Its subtitle is 5 Habits to Develop to Make Sharing Your Faith Story or Your Evangelism a little less awkward and stressful. Frost uses a BELLS, B-E-L-L-S, acronym for the habits. And last week we looked at the B in BELLS, which was blessing, to bless others. And bless, as you remember, means to add strength to the arm or to help lift others up. And we left with some homework last week. To bless 3 people, someone within the church, someone without of the church, and someone that we really don't like very much. How'd that go for you? I'm going to admit I didn't get all 3 of them done. But I got 2 of them done. And I feel like I was blessed by someone that I usually annoy. So I'm going to count it a win for the week. We are to bless others. Did you feel blessed when you were blessing others, though? By default, I was excited about what I was getting ready to do. And regardless of the way it turned out, I was excited to offer the love of Christ to someone else in that way. And I'll get around to the other one this week. I'm going to blame it on being at home unexpectedly, but that's probably not true. But anyways. By blessing others, we live questionable lives, a life that surprises unbelievers and sparks curiosity in them as what causes us to live life the way that we do, and that then gives us opportunities to share about Jesus. Today, I want to look at another way we can not just bless others, but also affirm their value and worth, and that's the E in BELLS, and that stands for eating with other people. Now, I love food. A lot. And since it feels like really my whole day revolves around what food I'm eating right now and what food I'm going to eat next and maybe what food I'm going to eat tomorrow, I want us to look at how not just sharing a meal, the food at the table, but sharing the space at the table with others can create moments of mission. But before we get to that, I want us to look at 3 scriptures that talk about how the Son of Man came. The first 2 are well-known scriptures. The third one is a little bit surprising. In Mark 10, we read, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and gave his life as a ransom for many." In Luke 19, we read, "The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." And then in Luke 7, we read, "The Son of Man came eating and drinking." And you say, "Here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." Yep, Jesus came to earth eating and drinking. You see, the first two passages of the Son of Man tell us what Jesus came to do. The third one tells us how he did it. He did it around tables. One of the ways that we can surprise the world also is by how we use our table. One of the most surprising things about Jesus was who he hung out with, and most especially who he ate with. His detractors regularly accused him of being a drunkard and a glutton. Jesus was neither of those things, but obviously his determination and willingness to eat and drink with sinners, with tax collectors and prostitutes, gave his enemies plenty of ammunition. Throughout history and in all cultures, the invitation to share a table with someone else has been very profound and meaningful. There is something humbling and inherently welcoming both in being invited to sit at someone's table and share together in this most basic of human needs, and also in inviting others to join you at your table. And I will say that while table fellowship can happen anywhere, in a restaurant, in a cafeteria at a school, in the church basement, I would also like for us to consider the profound humility and trust involved when you are either invited into or you invite someone to your own table in your home. See, I want to explain how this feels. I have a relative who often hosts meals, which we greatly appreciate, but we always eat in their garage. Now, it's a nice garage. It's heated. It's got a bathroom in there, but it's the garage. And after a few years of this, we began to wonder, are we not worthy of going into your house to eat at the table? Are we too much of a mess? Is it too much of a bother for us to actually enter the home? When you invite someone into your home, into that sacred space, you're saying, I'm allowing you to see me in a more transparent way. You are worthy of sharing my sanctuary. You're worth the investment of my time, my energy, my food, and I'm willing to share my space, both figuratively and literally, with you. And while we don't know of Jesus owning his own home or table, you see Jesus use a table all the time in the Gospels to surprise the world. It's at a table that Jesus accepts the worship of a sinful woman and criticizes the self-righteousness of Simon the Pharisee. It's at a table that Jesus dispenses advice for how to welcome the poor into our lives. And it is at a table that Jesus reveals himself as the risen Lord after the walk on Emmaus. Our goal then is also to use the table to break down the walls that separate people in our society and bring them into community instead. And to be like Jesus, to surprise the world by who we invite to sit at our table. Throughout history and even today, who gets invited to sit at a table is a big deal. Which table you get to sit at has meaning. It often identifies value of relationships and your status. There is a table in every school cafeteria where all the cool kids sit together. And the rest of the kids know they're not invited to sit at that table. There's also another table where the not so cool kids sit that other kids also won't sit at. There's the kids' table at family gatherings, and that sigh of relief and that feeling of being grown when you're finally invited to sit with the adults at the big table. In a fancy restaurant, depending on what your last name is and how well you are known, you'll get a better table. You're either going to get a view of the lakeside dining or you're going to get a view of the kitchen and the busboys. It's interesting that the first miracle that Jesus performs is at a wedding around a table in Canaan where they've run out of wine. And he goes to turn the water into wine, and the water that he uses is water that was used for ceremonial cleansing. It's the water that was used to separate the righteous Jews from the Gentiles. And Jesus takes that and turns it into wine. He takes what was meant to restrict people and separate them from each other and turns it into rescue for the hosts and relationship for their guests. Who is sitting around your table matters. That is surely the case today, but it was even more so around Jewish tables in the first century. When a Jewish person, but particularly those who identified as Sadducees or Pharisees, would gather for a meal, they understood that time around a table to be an extension of worship that might take place in the temple. And I really love that thought, that what takes place around our table should be an extension of worship. However, for the Pharisees, that meant that the purity laws and the regulations which they applied to the temple were then also transferred to their dinner tables. There were strict regulations regarding who should and should not be allowed to sit at which table. Only those who could uphold the religious purity laws were allowed within the courts of the temple. Only those of a certain ethnicity and sex were allowed within the inner courts of the temple. And so the meal practices of the first century Jews reflected this as well. That means that if you weren't Jewish, if you weren't a devout Jewish male at that, you would never have a seat at the table. Meals were also a time when our social status was affirmed. This is a strict socioeconomic hierarchy that was upheld and promoted for many centuries. Those of the same social standing would share meals together so they might mutually share in honor. It was very rare that a Jew of a higher social standing would invite someone of a lower economic class to sit at their table. Because if that person could not return the favor of hosting them back in the same manner that they did, both households would experience shame. So not wanting to inadvertently dishonor the name of God by breaking one of their 617 rules, many Jews made sure that the wealthy ate with the wealthy and the poor ate with the poor. But then here comes Jesus. And of course, he turned all these practices upside down. We read in Mark 7 of a group of Pharisees accusing Jesus' disciples of eating with unwashed hands and of not following the tradition of the elders. And Jesus himself criticizes a group of wealthy Jews for only hosting dinners for those of a similar social status. He then challenges them to set aside their honor so that they might feed those who are most in need instead of feeding those who already have more than enough. That would be an important thing for us to remember in the coming months. We read over and over and over again of the Jewish upper class complaining about Jesus because of who he shared a meal with, because of who was sitting at his table. Jesus routinely ate with tax collectors like Matthew and Zacchaeus, with prostitutes, with fishermen, with lepers and outcasts. Sharing a meal with someone in the first century meant that you were also willing to share in their social status. So sitting at a table with Zacchaeus, the wee little man, the tax collector, would have been severely dishonorable. To the mind of a Pharisee or a scribe looking at them, sharing a meal with Zacchaeus would be like sharing in his sin. So they believe Zacchaeus steals from the Jewish people, and you, by eating with him, are affirming his behavior, so you are in essence saying that you would also be willing to steal from the Jews as well. But this is not at all what Jesus is doing. Jesus didn't condone the actions of the people that he ate with. He just welcomed them to his table. He was willing to share in their social status of even the most shameful so that he might have the opportunity to lovingly challenge them to repent of their sins and to break down the barriers keeping them from a relationship with his Father. Jesus was more than willing to befriend sinners and to be seen as intimately associated with those deemed ceremonial impure, so that he might show them a way out of the darkness and into his light. He said to everybody, I got a seat for you at my table. I'm willing to break bread with you. And this is important for us. That invitation for the less than to sit at the table and to share a meal with Jesus, who is the King of Kings, is woven throughout Scripture. And perhaps the most striking example of the grace and intimate connection that we experience with Jesus in table fellowship doesn't happen in a story of Jesus, but it happens with his ancestor, King David. We'll read from 2 Samuel 9, the story of David and Jonathan's son. David asked, "Is there anyone still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba, and they summoned him to appear before David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. The king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. And Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lodabar." And so King David had him brought from Lodabar, from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel. And when Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. Remember, he's crippled. David said, "Mephibosheth, at your service," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" The king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." And now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. The invitation extended to Mephibosheth to dine at the king's table was no ordinary act of charity. In the social cultural context of that time, it signified recognition, acceptance, and respect. The king's table was reserved for the family and esteemed guest. Hence, it was a space of honor and community. Now, Mephibosheth is Saul's grandson, and he would usually be looked at as a potential political threat. Usually, when one king overtakes another king, they kill everyone from the other king's family to ensure that there is no uprising. But here is Mephibosheth being offered space at the king's table instead. And what else do we know of Mephibosheth? He's a crippled man. For that reason alone, he would have been outcast from these people. And he is living in obscurity in a place called Lodabar. Lodabar is basically a ghetto town in biblical towns. The word means no pasture, no word, no communication. It's a derogatory name for a place denoting that its residents lack intelligence and that the ground was basically worthless. It couldn't produce anything of value. So Mephibosheth was in exile in the worst area possible. He's an enemy of the state, he's an invalid, and he is outcast. But David invites him to eat at the king's table. And this is a vivid demonstration of unfettered grace and profound kindness. And it's a foreshadowing of how Christ will welcome the less than to his table as well. Mephibosheth expected the king's wrath, and instead he got grace. Unbelievable grace. David would show him kindness. He didn't need to be afraid of anything because he would be protected by the king himself. And David would restore to him everything that his family had lost. And best of all, he would regularly eat at the king's table, not as a guest, not as a person they were taking pity on, but recognized as a son of the king. And when Mephibosheth asked David why he was willing to do such an extravagant thing for him, why would you return my inheritance? Why have me sit at your table? Why identify me as one of your sons? David says, it's not for anything that you do. It's my love for Jonathan, your father. I'm keeping the blood covenant. It's my love for the Father. Can you hear Jesus there? There is another question, though, asked in this story that's just as important for us to remember as our own invitation to come and take our seat. The king asked, is there still no one alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? And the servant Ziba went out and got Mephibosheth. It's the very question we should be considering this morning. Is there no one left for me to show kindness to? Who can we bring to the king's table? I don't think it's any coincidence that Jesus elected to spend his last night with disciples around a table, teaching them, loving them, serving them by washing their feet. All four Gospels speak about the Last Supper. Matthew, Mark, and Luke speak of the new covenant that Jesus puts into place, the breaking of the bread, the sharing of the cup to seal our relationship with God, to guarantee that we have a place around the table. But John offers a new commandment as well. In verse 34, he tells us, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know you are my disciples if you love one another. And so we are called to go out and search for those who are missing from the king's table. And we point them to his table by first inviting them to ours. When it comes to associating with those that our circles might consider being on the margins or a little less than, how do we react? Who might we be willing to welcome into our family of faith? Are there any people in our lives that we would be hesitant to be seen sharing a meal with? In the book, Surprise the World, Michael Frost says we should be radical socializers instead. What a thought. How can our socializing become more radical? Well, we can begin at our tables. The table can be a surprising place where we invite people that gets them to ask, why are you breaking bread with me? How am I worthy to be at your table? The table is a forum for conversation and entertainment. It's a place of rest. It's also a place of reconciliation. At the table, usually, we talk. We work things out. We figure things out. We learn together. We explore through our conversations and our fellowship. So instead of just inviting your neighbors to church or to a church event, why not start by inviting them into your home to sit at your table? Simon Carey Holt is a theologian who is also a professional chef. He has this to say about how the table creates community. It is through the daily practice of the table that we live a life worth living. Through the table, we know who we are, where we come from, what we value and believe. At the table, we learn what it means to be family and how to live in responsible, loving relationships. Through the table, we live our neighborliness and citizenship. We express our allegiance to certain places and communities and claim our sense of home and belonging. At the table, we celebrate beauty and express solidarity with those who are broken and hungry. Table fellowship is hard, though. As Christians, sometimes we become victims of the holy huddle, which means we usually only invite other Christians to our tables because that's who we're more comfortable with. But I think Jesus calls us to foster community with unbelievers as well. I think there's a place for us to come to a table in a bar with someone who's hurting. I think there's a place for us to come and sit at the table of a single parent who's struggling to get by. I think there are all sorts of tables that we need to be sitting at that make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. In Jesus' time, a person would never eat with someone of a different social standing, and certainly never with someone of a different religion. But Jesus turned all of that on its head, and he ate with people first, and he asked for their repentance later. We need to be radical socializers like that too. And I go back to the Last Supper, and again, it's no coincidence that when Jesus gives his disciples a practice to remember him by, it's by breaking bread and drinking wine at the table. These days when we celebrate communion or the Lord's Supper, it's pretty formal and liturgical, but the first Christians celebrated it in the context of a banquet, a meal shared together around a table. So in the first century, the table was the primary symbol of Christian worship, not the pulpit, not the worship band, not even the cross. It was the sharing of community around a table. In our quest to live questionable lives, the kind of lives that intrigue our neighbors and strangers to ask us questions about our faith, one way we can do that is by being purposeful and loving in who we welcome at our table. You already eat every day. What would happen if you brought another person to your table just one time a week? Just one person that you either haven't or usually wouldn't share your space with. If we practice hospitality like that, we would have 52 opportunities in a single year to share our faith with those who are questioning and searching for Jesus. Now, I understand this can be quite challenging for many people, myself included. I have not been blessed with the gift of hospitality. You will sit at my house for several hours before I remember to offer you a glass of water. And I am not particularly great with small talk. At conferences, I am the attendee who regularly asks if I get to sit by who I want to sit by, and if you're going to make me play any goofy getting to know you games. Those things stress me out. I don't like them. I am not great with strangers, but I am pretty great with Jesus. And I do have faith that he will guide my hands and feet in service and my words in sharing my faith with whoever is sitting at my table so that those interactions will be effective, not for me, but for him. Now, you've probably guessed by this point that your challenge for this week will be to eat with someone new. A coworker, a neighbor, that person that really rubs you the wrong way. If possible, and if it's safe for you, invite them into your home to do it that way. But if that's not possible, invite them to whatever table you're going to be at. Welcome them as Jesus would. Invite the unpopular and the outcast, as well as your friends and work colleagues and relatives. There are so many people that we assume have a relationship with Christ that in actuality do not. Invite them to your table. Let's show the world what heaven will be like. Jesus regularly used the illustration of a banquet to describe his kingdom, and we can demonstrate this literally over a delicious meal that we share with friends and soon-to-be friends. The interactions at a table between Jesus and those who were outcasts, and between David and Mephibosheth, unfold a beautiful paradigm of kindness that is intentional, it's radical, and it's transformative. It disrupts societal norms, it crosses boundaries, and offers a new beginning to those on its receiving end. It embodies a kindness that reflects the very heart of God, and a grace that embraces, restores, uplifts, and blesses everyone. Let's surprise the world with our tables. I'll invite you now to stand. We'll sing our final hymn.